In the autumn of 1864, when the American Civil War stained the nation with blood and despair, a different kind of darkness descended upon the remote village of Whitechapel, nestled in the misty hills of rural Massachusetts. The records speak of a peculiar case, the Morgan household and their young son, Elijah. Of the 17 physicians who examined the boy over 3 years, 11 abandoned their practice entirely, 4 were committed to asylums, and 2 disappeared without a trace. What began as scientific inquiry ended with sealed testimonies locked away in Harvard Medical School's restricted archives for over a century. The Morgan family farmhouse still stands today, its windows like hollow eyes watching the valley below. Local historians speak in hushed tones about what transpired there, not out of superstition or religious fervor, but from a more disturbing realization. What happened to Elijah Morgan wasn't supernatural. It was something far more unsettling, a case where science itself retreated in fear, unwilling to document what it couldn't comprehend. You might think you've heard all the dark chapters of medical history, the lobotomies, the sanitariums, the brutal treatments justified under the banner of progress. But this case remains largely unexamined, buried beneath layers of institutional silence and academic discomfort. The question isn't whether you believe in the extraordinary, but whether you're prepared to confront how easily rational minds can shatter when faced with something beyond their understanding. Because the truth about Elijah Morgan isn't that he was possessed or cursed, it's that he forced the most brilliant scientific minds of his generation to question the very nature of human consciousness. And some questions once asked cannot be unasked. Whitechapel existed in perpetual twilight during those years, shrouded by fog that rolled down from the northern hills each evening and lingered until mid-morning. The constant moisture fed towering pines that surrounded the village, creating a natural barrier that muffled sounds and disoriented travelers. It was a place of whispers, the soft hissing of rain on slate roofs, the distant crack of branches in the surrounding forest, the creak of wooden boards expanding and contracting with the damp. The Morgan family had lived there for 3 generations. Samuel Morgan, a reserved widower who served as the town's clockmaker, was known for his precision and reliability. His workshop stood adjacent to their home, a modest 2-story structure at the edge of town, where he lived with his son Elijah and his sister Margaret, who had moved in to help care for the boy after his mother died in childbirth. Margaret Morgan was a slender, austere woman who had once studied at a women's college before returning to care for her nephew. She maintained a meticulous household and was respected, if somewhat feared, by the townspeople. In the emerging clash between traditional medicine and the new scientific approaches, Margaret sided firmly with progress. She maintained correspondence with female physicians in Boston and New York, collected scientific journals, and had converted a back room of the house into a modest library. Elijah himself was 7 years old when the incidents began, a thoughtful child with unusually pale skin and dark, observant eyes. He spoke little but watched everything, following conversations with an intensity that made adults uncomfortable. In a different time, perhaps in a different family, this behavior might have been dismissed as mere childish oddity. But in the Morgan household, where empirical observation was valued, Elijah's peculiarities were noted, documented, and ultimately investigated. The first to notice something truly unusual was Jacob Reeves, the village schoolteacher who had recently returned from university studies in Philadelphia. One Tuesday afternoon in October, as autumn leaves gathered in drifts against the schoolhouse door, he observed young Elijah sitting alone during lunch break, whispering to himself while tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Concerned, Reeves approached, only to find the boy had drawn a perfect anatomical diagram of a human brain, labeled with terminology that Reeves himself barely recognized from his university anatomy course. "Elijah," he asked, crouching beside the boy, "where did you learn these words?" The child looked up, his expression oddly blank. "I didn't learn them," he replied simply. "I remembered them." Reeves might have dismissed this as a child's imagination, perhaps influenced by medical books in his aunt's collection, had it not been for what happened later that afternoon. During history lessons, Elijah suddenly stood, walked to the blackboard, and began writing in a fluid, elegant script entirely unlike his usual childish scrawl. The words, in perfect Latin, described surgical procedures that wouldn't be developed for another 20 years. When Reeves gently took the chalk from the boy's hand, Elijah blinked several times, looked around in confusion, and asked why everyone was staring at him. He had no memory of standing or writing on the board. The teacher reported the incident to Samuel Morgan that evening, his hands trembling slightly as he described what he'd witnessed. "I wouldn't trouble you with this, Mr. Morgan, but I've never seen anything like it." It wasn't just the words, it was as if someone else was using his hand. Samuel listened gravely, thanked the teacher for his concern, and assured him that a physician would examine the boy. What he didn't reveal was that this wasn't the first unusual incident. For weeks, he'd heard Elijah speaking in his sleep, not in the nonsensical mutterings of a child, but in structured, technical language, describing medical conditions and treatments with clinical precision. That night, Samuel found his son sitting upright in bed, eyes open but unseeing, reciting what sounded like a lecture on cerebral anatomy. When he touched the boy's shoulder, Elijah collapsed back onto his pillow, falling instantly into normal sleep, with no recollection in the morning. The image of his son's vacant expression haunted Samuel. It wasn't fear he felt, but a profound, aching sadness, as if his child were slowly being erased and replaced by something else, something that used his voice and wore his face, but wasn't truly him. Dr. William Harrison, the town's only physician, arrived the following day. A Civil War veteran who had served as a field surgeon, Harrison had seen enough horrors to develop a steely pragmatism. Yet even he seemed disconcerted after examining Elijah, who remained perfectly normal throughout the visit. A quiet, somewhat shy boy who answered questions appropriately and showed no signs of fever or physical distress. "There's nothing physically wrong with him," Harrison concluded, packing away his stethoscope. "But I'd like to observe him overnight. These episodes you describe, they're unusual." That evening, as Harrison sat in a chair beside Elijah's bed, the transformation occurred again. The boy sat up suddenly, his movements mechanical, and began to speak, not in the voice of a child, but in the measured cadence of a lecturer. "The temporal lobe's function in memory storage remains poorly understood," he stated flatly. "Current treatment methods for lesions in this region are inadequate. My research suggests alternative approaches." Harrison, despite his experience, felt his skin prickle with unease. What disturbed him most wasn't just the content, it was the pronoun. "My research." As if whatever spoke through the boy was describing its own work. When he reported back to Samuel and Margaret the next morning, Harrison chose his words carefully. "I believe Elijah may be experiencing a form of somnambulism, perhaps triggered by material he's been exposed to in your scientific texts, Miss Morgan." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "He doesn't have access to my medical journals, Doctor. And even if he did, he couldn't possibly understand the advanced neurological concepts he's describing." Harrison hesitated before replying. "Then perhaps we should consult a specialist from Boston. Someone with experience in unusual mental conditions." The first specialist arrived 2 weeks later, and so began the scientific inquiry that no textbook would ever document, and that no medical journal would dare publish. Dr. James Whitfield arrived from Massachusetts General Hospital on a gray November afternoon, bringing with him the latest diagnostic equipment and a reputation for solving the most perplexing neurological cases. His credentials were impeccable. Trained at Edinburgh and Paris, published in respected journals, a founding member of the American Neurological Association. What he lacked in bedside manner, he compensated for with brilliant analytical skills. "I don't deal in mysteries, only in undiscovered mechanisms," he told the Morgan family as he unpacked his instruments in the parlor. The mind is complex, but ultimately knowable. For 3 days, Whitfield observed and documented Elijah's behavior, waiting for one of the episodes Samuel and Margaret had described. The boy remained frustratingly normal, quiet, well-behaved, showing no signs of the phenomena that had alarmed his family and the local physician. On the 4th night, as a storm lashed against the windows, Whitfield dozed in a chair outside the boy's bedroom. A sudden silence woke him, the unnatural quiet that comes when rain stops abruptly. From behind Elijah's door came the sound of a scratching pencil, moving with mechanical precision. Whitfield entered to find the child sitting cross-legged on the floor in the darkness, drawing by moonlight. The paper before him contained not childish scribbles, but detailed anatomical sketches of the human brain, cross-sections revealing structures that even Whitfield, with his specialized training, barely recognized. Beside each drawing were annotations in a tight, professional script, completely unlike Elijah's handwriting. "Elijah?" Whitfield asked softly. The boy looked up, but his eyes reflected the moonlight strangely, appearing almost silver. "He's asleep," came the reply in a voice too measured, too adult to belong to a 7-year-old. "I'm using his hands. They're small, but adequate." Whitfield felt his scientific detachment wavering. "Who am I speaking with?" A slight smile crossed the boy's face. "Someone who studied the brain long before you were born, Doctor. Someone who was not permitted to complete his work." "What work is that?" Whitfield asked, his mouth suddenly dry, mapping the pathways between memory and consciousness. "Finding the physical location of the self." The pencil continued moving across the paper, adding details to the drawing. "Your contemporary science believes consciousness emerges from neural activity. You have it backward." Before Whitfield could respond, Elijah's body slumped forward. The doctor caught him before he hit the floor, feeling the child's pulse racing beneath his fingers. When Elijah opened his eyes moments later, he was himself again, confused, frightened, with no memory of the conversation. Whitfield's report to Samuel and Margaret the next morning was clinical but troubled. "Elijah appears to be experiencing a form of dissociative state, possibly triggered by trauma. However, the knowledge displayed during these episodes is anomalous. It cannot be explained by any current understanding of psychology." "What are you suggesting?" Samuel asked, his voice tense. "I'm not suggesting anything supernatural," Whitfield clarified quickly, "but I would like to bring colleagues to observe. This case requires multiple perspectives." Within a month, 3 more specialists had visited the Morgan house. Each witnessed similar episodes, Elijah speaking in languages he had never studied, writing complex equations, drawing anatomical structures with professional precision. During one episode, observed by a Harvard neurologist, the boy correctly diagnosed a heart condition in the doctor himself, one that had not yet been detected and would be confirmed 3 months later. The physicians began to show signs of strain. Dr. Whitfield, initially the most composed, developed a persistent tremor in his right hand. He woke from nightmares in which he was dissecting a brain, only to find it was his own. The Harvard neurologist abruptly cancelled his 3rd visit, citing personal reasons. He would later resign from his position and relocate to a remote part of Maine. Margaret Morgan, ever methodical, began keeping detailed records of the episodes, their duration, triggering factors, content. She noted that they occurred most frequently between 2 and 4 a.m., lasted an average of 27 minutes, and often referenced research that seemed decades ahead of current medical understanding. "It's as if he's channeling knowledge from the future," she confided to her brother one evening after Elijah was asleep. "Or from somewhere else entirely." Samuel shook his head. "That's impossible, Margaret. There must be a rational explanation." But as winter deepened and more specialists came and went, rationality seemed increasingly elusive. The Morgan household became a place of whispers and tension. Servants refused to stay overnight. Villagers crossed to the other side of the street when they saw the family in town. The local minister suggested, diplomatically, that perhaps the family might benefit from spiritual counsel. Through it all, Elijah himself remained an island of normalcy during his waking hours, a quiet, thoughtful boy who loved drawing, though only childish sketches when conscious, and showed a talent for mathematics. He seemed unaware of his nocturnal transformations, though he complained increasingly of headaches and fatigue. In February 1865, as the Civil War ground toward its bloody conclusion, Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell, the first woman to receive a medical degree in the United States, arrived at the Morgan House. Unlike her male colleagues, she approached Elijah not as a medical curiosity, but as a child in distress. "Tell me about your dreams, Elijah," she asked gently during their first meeting. The boy hesitated. "I don't remember most of them, but sometimes I dream I'm someone else. Someone older who knows things I don't know." "Is this person kind to you?" she asked. Elijah's face clouded. "No. He wants me to go away inside, so he can use my hands and my voice." That night, Blackwell observed one of the episodes. Unlike the other physicians, she attempted to engage directly with whatever intelligence seemed to be speaking through the child. "You're hurting him," she said firmly after listening to the entity lecture for several minutes on neural pathways. "Whatever knowledge you possess isn't worth the damage you're causing to this boy." The entity paused. When it spoke again, the voice was colder. "Damage is necessary for progress, Doctor. My research was interrupted before completion. The boy is merely a temporary vessel." "Research into what?" Blackwell demanded. "The separation of consciousness from the physical brain," came the reply. "The ultimate preservation of the self, beyond bodily death." Blackwell felt a chill despite the room's warmth. "Who are you?" A smile spread across Elijah's face that belonged to no child. "My name would mean nothing to you, but I was once respected in Vienna before my colleagues declared my work unethical and destroyed my papers. They couldn't destroy what I had already learned, however, what I had already preserved." Blackwell stayed for 2 weeks, developing a treatment plan combining physical care, regular sleep schedules, and mental exercises designed to strengthen Elijah's sense of self. During her stay, the episodes decreased in frequency, though not in intensity when they occurred. Before departing, she took Margaret aside. "Your nephew is engaged in a kind of internal battle for control of his own mind. These episodes aren't seizures or mental illness as we understand them. They're something else. Something I've never encountered in my practice." "What should we do?" Margaret asked, her usual composure cracking. "Keep detailed records. Continue the regimen I've prescribed. And," Blackwell hesitated, "consider the possibility that you may need to relocate. Some places have a history that clings to them. This village, this house, they may be part of the problem." After Blackwell's departure, the Morgan family found themselves increasingly isolated. The stream of medical consultations had drawn unwanted attention. Rumors spread through Whitechapel, whispers of possession, madness, experiments gone wrong. Children were forbidden from playing with Elijah. Samuel's clock business suffered as customers found reasons to take their repairs elsewhere. Throughout the spring of 1865, Elijah's condition worsened despite Margaret's faithful implementation of Dr. Blackwell's regimen. The episodes increased in frequency and duration. During his waking hours, the boy became withdrawn, spending hours staring at nothing, responding to questions with delayed mechanical answers. "We're losing him," Samuel told his sister one evening, his voice breaking. "Whatever this is, it's taking my son away piece by piece." That night, they heard Elijah screaming from his bedroom, not the measured voice of the entity, but the terrified cry of a child. When they rushed in, they found him pressed against the headboard, eyes wide with fear. "He's trying to push me out," the boy sobbed. "He says I don't need this body anymore, that he does. He says he's almost strong enough to stay." The desperation that seized the Morgan household after that night manifested in a flurry of letters to every medical authority Samuel and Margaret could think of. They wrote to universities, to private physicians, to medical journals. Most went unanswered. Those who did respond expressed polite regret at being unable to help with such an unusual case. In June, when hope had nearly abandoned them, a response arrived from Dr. Oliver Blackwood of Johns Hopkins. Unlike the specialists who had come before, Blackwood's expertise wasn't in neurology, but in the emerging field of psychology. His letter was direct and refreshingly free of scientific caution. "What you describe," he wrote, "sounds like a case of consciousness displacement, a theory largely rejected by the medical establishment, but one I've been researching for 7 years. I've documented 17 similar cases, though none as pronounced as your son's. I will come at once." Blackwood arrived a week later, a tall, thin man with intense eyes and a nervous energy that manifested in constant movement. He spoke quickly, interrupting himself with new thoughts before completing previous ones, yet demonstrated remarkable patience when interviewing Elijah. After reviewing Margaret's meticulous records and speaking privately with the boy, Blackwood gathered the family in the parlor. His expression was grave. "Based on everything I've seen," he began, "I believe Elijah is experiencing a phenomenon similar to spiritual mediumship, but with a crucial difference. Instead of channeling the dead, which I consider largely fraudulent, he appears to be accessing memories preserved through scientific means." "What do you mean, preserved?" Samuel asked. Blackwood hesitated. "There are researchers, primarily in Europe working in secrecy, who believe consciousness can be externalized from the brain and preserved. Most of their experiments have failed or been abandoned as unethical. But if someone succeeded, even partially, you're suggesting some dead scientist has placed his consciousness inside my son?" Samuel's voice rose with disbelief. "Not his full consciousness," Blackwood clarified, "more like patterns. Memory fragments, knowledge." Seeking a new physical home to continue work that death interrupted. Margaret, who had remained silent, suddenly spoke. The entity mentioned Vienna, and research that was declared unethical. Blackwood's eyes widened. "When exactly did these episodes begin?" "Last October," Samuel replied. "The 17th was when the schoolteacher first noticed." Blackwood pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping through pages until he found what he sought. October 12, 1864. Dr. Heinrich Schreiber, former professor of neuroscience at the University of Vienna, died in his laboratory. His papers were seized and destroyed by university authorities due to moral concerns about the nature of his experiments. A heavy silence filled the room, broken only by the steady ticking of the clock Samuel had built. "What was he researching?" Margaret finally asked. "The physical preservation of consciousness," Blackwood replied quietly. He believed the self could be extracted from the brain and stored in what he called memory solutions, chemical compounds that could hold neural patterns indefinitely. That night, as Blackwood kept watch, Elijah experienced his most violent episode yet. It began as usual. The boy sitting up suddenly, eyes open but vacant, but quickly escalated, his body convulsed, muscles contorting unnaturally. When he spoke, the voice was no longer calm and clinical but desperate, almost pleading. "The solution is degrading," it said through Elijah's mouth. "I must complete the transfer soon or lose everything. The boy's resistance is problematic." Blackwood, setting aside his observational detachment, addressed the entity directly. "Dr. Schreiber, if that's who you are." A pause, then a smile that twisted Elijah's childish features. "You know my work, Doctor. I know you died last October," Blackwood responded evenly. "Whatever you preserved of yourself is incomplete. It's harming this child." "Regrettable but necessary," came the reply. "My research must continue. The boy's consciousness will be absorbed or displaced. Either outcome advances our understanding." "Our understanding," Blackwood repeated. "You're dead, Doctor. Whatever this is, this fragment of you, it isn't life. It's an echo." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Elijah's face. "I am preserving knowledge that would otherwise be lost." The sacrifice of one untrained mind for the advancement of science is not yours to make, Blackwood interrupted, and your research has already been rejected by the scientific community. What you're attempting now isn't preservation, it's invasion. The entity fell silent, though Elijah's body remained rigid, hands clenched into fists. Then, without warning, the boy collapsed back onto the bed, unconscious. In the morning, Blackwood outlined his theory to the Morgans. The preservation solution Schreiber had created before his death had somehow found its way to America, perhaps brought by a colleague or student. Its physical form had since degraded, but the consciousness pattern it contained had found a receptor in Elijah's developing brain. The boy's neural pathways are still forming, Blackwood explained. His sense of self isn't fully solidified. That makes him vulnerable to this kind of intrusion. "Can you help him?" Samuel asked, his voice hollow with exhaustion. Blackwood hesitated. "I believe so, but my methods are experimental. They involve strengthening Elijah's own consciousness while creating conditions inhospitable to the invading pattern." The treatment began the next day. Blackwood administered carefully measured doses of botanical compounds that he claimed would stabilize neural boundaries. He engaged Elijah in intensive memory exercises, reinforcing the boy's personal history and sense of identity. At night, he placed specific minerals around the bed that he believed disrupted the preservation pattern's ability to manifest. For 3 days, nothing changed. Elijah continued to experience episodes, though they grew shorter and seemed to frustrate the entity. On the 4th night, as a summer storm broke over Whitechapel, Blackwood prepared for what he called the final separation. "Tonight we force a choice," he told the Morgans. "Either the pattern fully integrates with Elijah, essentially destroying him as an individual, or it must abandon him entirely." The ritual, if it could be called that, combined elements of science and what appeared to be mysticism. Blackwood arranged 7 candles in a specific pattern around Elijah's bed. He administered a final dose of his compound and placed a small, ornate box carved with strange symbols on the bedside table. "The box is lined with materials that attract consciousness patterns," he explained. "If we can draw it out of Elijah during an episode, the box will serve as a temporary vessel." "And then?" Margaret asked. "We destroy it," Blackwood said simply. Fire should be sufficient. As midnight approached, Elijah fell into a restless sleep. Samuel and Margaret waited in the hallway while Blackwood remained with the boy. At precisely 12, they heard Elijah's voice, not his own, but the cold, adult tone of the entity, raised in what sounded like protest. Then came a scream, not of pain, but of rage, followed by absolute silence. When Samuel burst into the room moments later, he found Blackwood kneeling beside Elijah, checking his pulse. The candles had extinguished simultaneously. The box on the table was closed, sealed with wax that Blackwood had melted from one of the candles. "Is he—" Samuel couldn't finish the question. "He's himself," Blackwood assured him. "Only himself now. The pattern has been extracted." Elijah woke the next morning with no memory of the previous night. For the first time in months, his eyes were clear, his movements natural. He complained of a headache, but otherwise seemed perfectly normal. A 7-year-old boy interested in breakfast and wondering if he could go outside to play. Blackwood departed that afternoon, taking the sealed box with him. "I'll destroy this properly," he promised. "What it contains isn't truly alive, but it should be treated with appropriate precautions." His parting advice to the Morgans was stark. "Leave Whitechapel. Some experiences leave impressions," he said. "Some places retain memories. Start fresh somewhere distant." The Morgan family relocated to Colorado the following month. Elijah grew into a healthy young man with no recollection of his ordeal. He developed a keen interest in clockmaking like his father, but showed no particular aptitude for medicine or science. By all accounts, he lived a normal, contented life. Dr. Blackwood's promised paper on consciousness displacement never appeared in any medical journal. When Samuel wrote to inquire about it a year later, his letter was returned marked, "No such person at this address." Further investigation revealed that while Oliver Blackwood had indeed been associated with Johns Hopkins, he had left abruptly in August 1865, immediately after his visit to Whitechapel, abandoning his research and disappearing completely. The sealed box was never found. In 1912, an elderly Elijah Morgan, by then a respected clockmaker in Denver, received a strange letter from Vienna. It contained no message, only a yellowed photograph of a stern-faced man in academic robes. On the back was written a single sentence: "He found another way." Elijah burned the photograph immediately. That night, for the first time in nearly 50 years, he dreamed of equations he didn't understand and anatomical structures he couldn't name. He woke with a splitting headache and the unsettling feeling that something was trying to remember him. 3 days later, Elijah Morgan died peacefully in his sleep. The doctor noted nothing unusual, except for a strange precision to the time of death, exactly 3:33 a.m., as if his heart had stopped on the stroke of a perfectly calibrated clock. The case files remained sealed in Harvard's archives until 1967, when a graduate student discovered them while researching the history of neurological treatment. By then, the field of consciousness studies had advanced significantly, but still not enough to explain what had happened in that remote Massachusetts village a century earlier. Modern science might dismiss the Morgan case as an elaborate fabrication or explain it away as an undiagnosed neurological condition. But the questions it raises linger uncomfortably at the edges of our understanding. If consciousness can be preserved beyond death, even partially, if it can seek new vessels for itself, then where does the self truly reside? And what happens when science pierces veils it was never meant to lift? Some knowledge perhaps refuses to be studied. Some secrets study us back.